just a second. Okay. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The motion for today's debate is: this House would ban sports betting. Representing the proposition, we have the team from Qatar, and on the opposition, we have team from Italy. From the proposition side, our speakers are: first speaker is Fatima, second speaker is Amira, third speaker is Mira, reply speaker is Amira. On the opposition side, our speakers are: first speaker is Thea, second speaker is Sara, third speaker is Tesira, and the reply speaker is Sarah. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The first and last minute of each speech is considered protected time, during which points of information, POIs, may not be offered. The judges will signal the end of protected time at the 1 minute mark, after which POIs can be offered, and will signal the return to protected time at the 7 minute mark. At the 8 minute mark, they will give a double clap or ding to signal the end of speech. Additionally, there will be 3 claps or dings at 8:15, and the judges will stop listening at 8:30. Best of luck to both teams. I now hand over the floor to their judges, and most importantly, co-founder.
Sorry. Okay, is everyone ready? So, my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, well-cited proposition thoroughly characterizes and mechanizes what makes sports so addictive and why people are so prone to addiction. They do not thoroughly explain what the impacts of this is and why it eventually flows to our side. Because if they do not end up explaining why banning sports betting would actually prevent people from turning to addiction, all the issues they presented would not eventually be solved, and this is why we win this case. First of all, I would like to reinforce what they already stated about addiction. Addiction actually looks like people being addicted because of many factors. For example, societal pressure and people asking you to bet while they're in bars or at matches. But it's also caused by the life of the individual. Panel, a healthy individual that is not prone to depression or mental health issues and is not easily manipulated, is not gullible, will not turn to things like addiction. Mental health plays a huge part in people turning to addiction, such as sports betting, because, for example, they seek that dopamine rush that, for example, depression or other mental health issues deprives them of. If you look for dopamine, betting is obviously a form of obtaining dopamine when you win. And you could also be genetically prone towards gambling because of how your brain is wired. But what they miss is what this means. Because if people are so prone to betting, as they explained, if they are so manipulated and coerced by societal pressure and their own personality into betting, why banning sports betting would not actually work is that people would turn to other forms of addiction. They would gamble in other ways. It will not take away the distress that makes people look for that dopamine rush. No, thank you. And there are 2 scenarios at this point that will come into play. First of all, they would keep sports betting illegally, which is worse, and we will explain that later, because like it happened with alcohol drinking during prohibitionism, people will not stop doing what they find addictive if the causes of their addiction are still there. Or second, they would turn to other forms of gambling that are even worse, for example, slot machines, and I will elaborate on that later. Why is that so? Note 3 things about sports gambling in the status quo. First of all, there is state intervention that guarantees fairness. There are regulated bars or organizations, so if it's a scam, they scam you, for example, they do not give the money when you win, or if people harass you because you're in debt and you do not have the money to pay them back, you can sue that organization legally. You go up to the government or the court and you say, hey, they wronged me, can you repair that for me? And they will do that. If it's illegal, you cannot go up to the government and say, oh, I did this illegal thing, please repair that for me. Because they will say, well, it's your responsibility. And that is exclusive to our side, of course, because they do not have state intervention. Second, frequency. Sports gambling is less frequent than other forms, and they state that, of course, there are matches every day, and we cannot convince you that it's not accessible often. But think about something else, slot machines. If people do not have sports betting, they will turn to slot machines, probably, no thank you. And what slot machines are, they're accessible every day, all day. You can just go into a bar, sit as a slot machine, continuously press buttons, and you will go on like that for the entire day. You cannot do that with sports betting because although frequent, it's much less frequent, and that is what they missed. Another element is that of rationality. Betting, note panel, is different from gambling. Gambling is just mindlessly buying lottery tickets, for example, but betting needs rationale. You need to reason on why the team you're going to bet on is going to win. You need to be mindful while doing so, and that will fry your brain significantly less than actually going up to a slot machine and pressing a button all day or buying a lottery ticket, which are very mindless activities and end up harming your brain and rationale even more than betting. We are not, note panel, excusing addiction. We're not saying that sports betting is good. We're just saying that it's significantly not as worse as other forms of betting, such as gambling, slot machines, buying lottery tickets, etc. Now, with that said, we will move on to our first substantive argument, which is that of addicted individuals also turning to other forms of addiction when sports gambling is taken away from them. Individuals would be addicted anyways because, as we've stated, people would be struggling with mental health. They would be in other forms of distress that lead them to turn to gambling. And note panel that is what the state needs to act upon. The state does not have responsibility to prevent you from being unwell. By taking away what is addictive, they have the responsibility to actually act on the roots of the causes of the problem, and that is fixing what is making you uncomfortable. So helping you with your mental health, providing mental health support, or also providing societal support as well. So with that said, individuals would turn to other forms of addiction, for example, finding something else to bet on or gambling. It is better to bet on sports than something worse because of the rationality and frequency elements that I've previously explained. And it's also not exclusive in banning this betting because you don't solve their addiction, as we previously explained. So they'll get off on sports, people who are addicted to sports betting, maybe if they're sports lovers, but you'll be forcing them to turn to something more dehumanizing instead, like slot machines, as I previously explained, that they fry your brain and dopamine receptors even more. Yes, please?
Sports betting on your side, where companies literally have mechanisms to ensure that you lose. How then do you deal with this? Because it doesn't matter if you are rational about it.
Excuse me, slot machines do not have mechanisms to ensure that you lose. Also, excuse me, but if it's even less probable that companies can ensure that a team match is going to be won by a certain team than for a programmer to program a slot machine in order to make you win, like, for example, only one time in 5 billion. Like, what are the mechanisms that you can provide to prove that it's so improbable for a match to go the way you predict it to go as a company that wants to scam people? But anyways, people would also feel resentful and view sports in negative ways if sports betting was taken away from them, and this would cause a further impact of less trust in the government, a less cohesive society, and eventually a worse place for everybody to live in. But also, let's talk about engagement in society. Slot machines are available 24/7. They fry your brain. And you're no longer an active member of society, and you're dehumanized, and that is obviously harmful. Now on to our second argument, which is that of state intervention that keeps things safe. Right now, the state protects people who invest money in sports through legal organizations. Because, as I explained in framing, people can sue regularly organizations that scam them, and the state can control the direction that sports betting is taken. But if people were not to be available. If sports betting was made illegal, people would resort to black market because, as we've explained, they would still turn to addiction. And they would be giving money to unreliable organizations, and that would have no clue where that money would go. Or you could even lose money even if your team wins, because if these are illegal organizations, they could be scams, and you would have no guarantee that you would be able to get reparation if they end up scamming you, and you would lose even more money because they would take away that money from you. And overall, if you're not preventing the negative impact of why we're debating this motion today, why is side proposition even debating? Because people being addictive will still be in the status quo, and that would make their measure inefficient, and people would still lose money or even more, and that would make things work, and this is why you should vote for OP. Thank you.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Wait. It's not starting. Okay. I'll start my speech actually in 3, 2, 1. I'll deal with two things in this speech. Number one, let's actually deal with accessibility, because they tell you that the alternative is usually going to be illicit markets, or you turn to more conventional forms of gambling. And also later on in their speech, they talk about things like state trying to regulate. We're going to talk about why all of these fall, and I'm taking them at their very best case, where they don't actually provide analysis as to why this is true. But secondly then, on bringing back the principle that was not at all engaged with their first speaker, and why that alone is enough for us to win the debate. Firstly then, on accessibility, because what is one of their biggest pushes in this debate? Their essential push is, if people are already addictive, it means that they're probably going to turn to more illegal means where they can't do things like sue, etc. What we would say is that we think that the vast majority of individuals will not turn to these illegal markets anyway. We have three reasons for this. Number one, the fear of persecution is very high. At the point where you know that you can be criminalized, it means that there's a huge deterrence to you to even opt into this thing in the first place. Because the biggest cost on their side is, well, you might lose some money, and note that if you're already addictive, sure, you're already used to this loss of money that already happens, but the point where you can be criminalized for it provides a huge deterrence. Secondly, and they talk about things like suing, etc., where you can't, but that's exactly why you don't enter these illicit markets in the first place, because you don't have a guaranteed return. But note, this is even worse, because when you don't get your money on their side, you can't turn to authorities. But that's the exact reason why people don't opt into these things in the first place, because they know that sure, they may like gambling, but the point where they may lose $50,000, that's a huge deterrence as to why they won't enter these things in the first place. But thirdly, because we're banning it explicitly, it means that a lot of the things that try to encourage this sports betting is no longer in your face. When you don't have advertisements consistently looming on the streets, on the roads, or in the malls, this means that it's far easier for people to go away from a lot of the sports, like the sports betting that exists. So we think that a lot of the people who may end up sports betting, because note that we talked to you about in our first speech about how lots of people aren't just, dreaming about going to casinos as they grow older, but rather they're so involved in sports that they might want to take money out of it, right? So we think that at the point where essentially we ban this outright, this means that lots of people are not coerced into going into this in the first place. But note, I will be incredibly generous with opposition. I will assume that some people unfortunately end up going to these illicit markets in the first place. Why then is this a necessary trade-off that we ought to make in this debate? Firstly, we think that the worst of the worst bettors, we think, are going to go beyond limits on either side, but uniquely it is our side that prevents future victims of these sports betting from happening. Because note the analysis we told you from first, lots of individuals end up getting into sports betting because they think they can outsmart companies because they know so much about the NBA or F1 races. But at the point where they can't outsmart companies, that literally have thousands of people essentially calculating how it means where you can essentially cause a very limited amount of people to win but still get people sucked into this cycle, means that we essentially prevent a lot of future victims, thousands of individuals that may go into sports betting but may not necessarily, that's our side that essentially stops these people from even getting in the first place. But secondly, we also talked to you about scale of quantity. The fact that we think that most individuals will be deterred when they know that legal prosecution will happen. We think that the weighing is clear here. We think that at the point where people who are the worst of the worst bettors are going to be go off the limits either way, the fact that we prevent the most moderate individuals, which is the majority of people, from getting into these harms in the first place, that is enough for us to win the debate. Before moving on, go ahead.
Is sports betting worse than lobbying?
Note that we think that lobbying is far worse on your side, and I'll actually talk about this, because here they talk about things like regulations and lobbying. We agree that political capital is symmetric on either side. If we can ban at a particular slice of time, so can they with regulations. But the problem is that lobbying can exist into the long term. At the point where we take these players out of the market completely, it means that they no longer can, they've essentially reinvested their wealth into other industries, etc. But at the point where these companies still exist on their side, this means that they have the incentive to roll back these regulations. This can happen for a few reasons. Firstly, because a lot of these corporations still make a lot of money over time, they're able to grow their operations, means that essentially it's far easier for them to do things like lobbying. But secondly, note that politicians and governments consistently change. There's no guarantee that these regulations that they talk about will withstand. But at the point where we ban, it is far harder to essentially build an industry from the ground up as a politician. We think that it is far easier for them to roll back regulations and reverse a lot of the changes that have happened on their side. But the second thing that they tell you here is, well, they'll often turn to other forms of gambling. Firstly, we talked about this in framing. We are principally against all forms of gambling anyway, but unfortunately that is not the motion. But secondly, note that they missed our analysis here. The reason why lots of individuals are so ingrained within sports betting specifically is because they grew up loving sports. We think that at the point where you have to spend so much time every single week, and sometimes people who are the most obsessed every single day, analyzing how certain players like Bukayo Saka essentially go in the Premier League, means that you spend lots of time with this. It's not intrinsically because you just love the casino lights, but rather that you love the sport. We think at the point where essentially, we think that this is absolutely ridiculous to try to push in the debate. No, thank you. But the last thing that they tell you here is really weird, because they're like, this is better than other forms of gambling because at least you can be mindful about it. Panel, what? That is exactly the problem. People think that they can outsmart these companies when they are involved in sports themselves, but you cannot. Firstly, because human error exists at the point where you can still essentially still lose, because a lot of things will drastically change in sports. Maybe someone got injured, maybe a team suddenly got better overnight. But secondly, note that it is far worse at the point where you're likely to take this burden far higher because you are so ingrained in sports. Because I'll be generous, let's assume that the people who are so ingrained in sports betting somehow do go to other forms of betting. The fact that it is less personal to them means that the mental cost is far less for them. We think that the burden and essentially the impacts we brought to you from first, that a lot of individuals end up having their families affected. Essentially, when it's not just your ego that is being lost in sports, but rather a lot of money. We think that's when a lot of things, like for example, family tensions happen. When you have a lot of money that's being spent on this, and unfortunately, even in some of the worst cases, even domestic violence. Because note that a lot of these individuals who are in sports, when you see the Premier League, for example, essentially not only are you losing your ego, but the point where you lose a lot of your money in the process, this means that a lot of these family tensions get far worse on their side. But secondly, we essentially told you that a lot of this time spent analyzing means that if it's not personal to you, it won't be as addictive. But second clash then, I'll actually bring back the principle that they did not engage with at all. Because what did we tell you from the first speech? We essentially said that a lot of this exists on a spectrum, right? We think that some decisions to an extent are always coercive, but at the point where this is incredibly coercive, we think that the government has a principled right to ban it. Why do we think this is the case? Firstly, note that there's a huge third-party harm that exists. The point where your freedom of choice essentially infringes upon the freedom of others. When you essentially want to take, for example, your wife's money so that you can bet more in sports. When you essentially get really angered at a lot of sports betting that happens, we think that at the point where your choice does not exist in a vacuum anymore, but has pernicious impact on others, that is when your choice goes away. But secondly, and more importantly, this is a huge form of self-harm. At the point where you allow yourself to get into the cycle of addiction, where essentially it is far hard, it's super hard for you to opt out in the first place, because we gave you this analysis from first. The fact that biologically, when you have these dopamine hits, essentially when you win, but even when you don't, you crave it more when you lose. We think that a lot out of these things, not only because of the form, like the nature of gambling itself, but how involved you are in sports, we think that it is far harder for you, not just by peer pressure, but also biologically, to even opt out of this in the first place. Note that we have not just won on the cycle of addiction and actually protecting the most vulnerable and future victims, but also on the principle, it is a clear proposition ballot, even from the third speech.
Speech, I invite the second opposition.
Okay. Whenever everyone's ready. Proposition ready? Panel ready? Okay. So my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Two things you can hear from my speech. First, on rebuttal, after which I'll be moving on to the third and last substantive of our team line. First of all, I would like to engage the first part of my speech with the value principle that was brought by side proposition, since they have been talking about it extensively during their second speech. Well, I would like to first of all, bring forward our value point, which seems to be pretty self-explanatory. We think that in a liberal society, people are allowed to make decisions, financial decisions, with their own money. And I will do some further layering on the stakeholders of this in 1 second. But ultimately, we think that if a person wants to spend a reasonable amount of money on betting on sports, while rationally making decisions about what team they're going to vote for, what pony they're going to bet on, we don't particularly see the harm on society. We believe that in liberal societies where people have this right to active freedom, which means I get to do what I want as long as it doesn't harm anybody else or doesn't harm me extensively, we believe that these individuals do have a right to invest their money in whatever way they see fit. For example, what proposition is trying to tell you is that, for example, if a huge brand, like for example Kellogg's, says that, hey, if you buy many cereal boxes, you might win an Xbox. Basically, proposition tells you that Kellogg's is not allowed to do that, and buying those boxes with the chance that you might win an Xbox is basically addiction, and these people don't have the right to buy those cereal boxes. We don't think this particularly fair, and obviously this value falls on our side of the house, as it respects the active freedom that is the bedrock of liberal societies. But even if they tell us that society is able to intervene in the moment in which individuals extensively harm themselves by betting $50,000 or betting their entire house on the ponies. We tell you that actually banning sports, betting on sports actually worsens this. Why? Because we tell you during our first speech that addiction is not that simple to battle. It's caused by a series of elements. For example, it can be caused by genetic makeup, it could be caused by societal norms. This means that if I am prone to betting this huge amounts of money, which seems irrational, right? We agree. That means that I am highly addicted to chasing that dopamine rush. And that means that at that point in time, if we take away the sports betting, which is less frequent because there are not matches every single day, and it's much more regulated, these people are going to either chase black markets or are going to turn into more harmful ways of betting, like for example slots machines. And why are slots machines much more harmful? We have told you during the course of our speech. Why? Because at least when you're betting on sports, there is less frequency and you use your brain. You try to understand, okay, which team is more strong, which team is more likely to win 1 second. On the other side, slot machines are more likely to fry your brain because you sit on a chair all day and you push buttons. I'll take your POI.
Do you think most people will turn to illicit markets?
Yes. Okay, thank you for the POI. Absolutely. If you're talking about people that are willing to bet their entire house on the ponies, then yeah, we agree. If a person is so highly addicted to this type of gambling, we think that the moment to take that away, these people are not going to stop having this addiction. They're going to turn to this form of gambling that goes on underground. Now, moving on to a couple layerings of stakeholders during the course of this debate. Well, first of all, they tell us about people that invest a modest amount of capital into this type of betting. We tell you during the course of my speech that this is a principle of active freedom. I'm allowed to do whatever I want with my money as long as I'm spending $20 on betting on the ponies. I don't see why this is wrong. Also because it helps these sports organization, and it also helps boost the economy. But second, they tell us this whole point about these people having these huge addictions that will continue to spend their money, ruining their lives, ruining the lives of their families. We tell you that actually banning this would either make them turn to worse types of addiction, as I've just explained to you, or will make them actually turn to a black market of these betting rings, why is it not preferable to the status quo? Well, first of all, because there is no guarantee that these people will get their money back. It is an illicit market, which means that the state has no return from this type of illicit market, and the fact that it's an illicit market means that it's usually run by criminal rings, which we think is much less preferable to the status quo, where at least these people bet with safe organization that they're allowed to sue if anything goes wrong. And now, very quickly onto the three types of mechanisms they tell us to try to prove that sports betting is in some way worse than any other type of betting. First of all, they tell us that basically there's advertisement everywhere about sports betting. So every single time you open your phone, you see this advertisement about, oh, hey, vote for Manchester. They're going to win the whatever league next season. Well, we tell you that ultimately, even if you take this at the highest ground, this is a wash. Why? Because other forms of betting are also super present in advertising. Think about every single time you open a site and a pop-up with a slot machine appears, or a pop-up with an app that tells you to bet your money on politics or on electoral campaign appears. We think that ultimately, even if you take this at the higher ground, advertisement that tricks people into addiction is a wash on both sides. And second, they give us this whole mechanism about how there's this macho culture of, hey bro, bet on this team, that's so cool. Well, we think that actually worsens on their side of the house. Why? Because if there's already this macho idea of, hey, betting is so cool, we should do it because it's edgy, we think that in the moment in which you ban it, this means that this market goes underground, and once it's underground, it's even cooler to bet. That means that if you have this group of friends that peer pressure you into betting because it's so cool and edgy, this is going to be even more present in their side of the house because now it's even cooler. That was the same thing that happened with prohibitionism in America, where speakeasy bars were everywhere. Now, moving on to our third and last substantive, which is the exclusive benefits that sport betting actually has in society. There are two benefits that we want to bring to you today. First of all, engagement with sports, and second, the creation of better performances in sports. Let's start with the first one. Well, first of all, we think that sports betting, first of all, actually financially supports a lot of sports organizations. Why? Because in the moment in which a person bets on this organization, no thank you, in a moment in which these people actually bet on this organization, what happens? If the person actually wins a sum of money, a percentage of this money is taken and is given to the organization of the sports organization that has been bet on, and it's also another percentage is given to the actual organization that creates the system of betting. We think this is positive. Why? Because this helps a sports organization financially at a great level. And note here that it does not only help a major sports organization like the FIFA World Cup tournament, it also helps smaller sports organizations. And why is this positive? Because giving further financial aid to this sports organization, first of all, better said organization, and this is helpful especially in the case in which these organizations are much smaller and need this financial support. Second, this means that it helps better the events that are organized by this organization. And third, as a consequence, it betters the entertainment of engaging in that sport. Why is this important? Because ultimately, bettering the engagement that a society has with the entertainment that sports provides gives more emphasis to the importance of sports in society. Why is this important? Because sports is the number one activity that a person can watch in order to feel a sense of community. Think about every single time the team might win finals in a European tournament, every single person is strolling around their streets with their flag. We think the importance of community, of feeling the sense of community, is an exclusive benefit on our side. And second, we tell you that it creates better performances in sport. Why? Because if a person bets on a certain team or a certain player, and they think that player is going to do specifically well, it creates this mechanism of a sense of responsibility from the player or the team to perform better in those sports, which ultimately we think would lead to a better performance from the player, as they now have the sense of duty and responsibility. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay.
Judges, as a working class individual, it is extremely hard for me to believe on their side of the house that I would be spending $50,000 on betting in sport competitions. Now, third speaker of proposition tells you that she does not know how to access these illegal sites, so that ultimately means that a lot of people who are desperate enough, who are sport lovers enough, would not be able to do it. We tell you that if you are desperate enough, you will do it, and the problem is that on their side of the house, they do not resolve the point of the desperation of the addiction that these people feel in terms of the sport betting. Ultimately, we tell you that on our side of the house, we provided a very thorough characterization of why these people do the sport betting in the first place. First of all, they do it because they ultimately like to get the dopamine receptors from, essentially advocating and giving money to things that they really like. So for example, they really love sports. On their side of the house, they would be taking that away from people, making people less incentivized to actually engage with an activity that essentially they see as beneficial. And the moment in which they take that away, they do not explain to us how they would be solving the problem of the addiction in the first place. These people would feel like they do not have a resource anymore of how to spend their money in activities that they actually enjoy. What would they be resorting to, for example? To other forms that can in some way give them dopamine in the same way as a sport addiction betting. But this essentially does not happen because it's not the same thing. In the moment in which they do not really love that activity that they're investing money into anymore, they become dehumanized, and essentially the addiction gets even worse, and I will explain this better in our points of clash. On our first point of clash on the individual impacts. Now, they seem to believe that essentially when a person is harming themselves, this means that the state has a need to intervene, right? Well, we have to first understand what are the actual harms to the individual. Firstly, they tell you essentially that they would be increasing the ego of a person if they want to bet on sports. They're like essentially saying, hey, I'm so cool, I'm betting in sports. Now, first of all, it is actually much better to have an ego with the fact that you're betting into sports legally than to have an ego because you're betting into sports illegally, because that just makes you a criminal. But ultimately, we tell you that if you have belief in your favorite team, there's nothing wrong with wanting to give your financial investments to that team specifically in terms of legal organizations. But secondly, on this peer pressure, right? You essentially give us a very extreme example of these men who are going to be pressured in a way that is inexcusable to saying, hey, if I don't give my money to this sport organization, my friends are going to hate me. This is a little bit extreme, but apart from this, we believe that it is not exclusive to sport betting. If anything, it gets even worse in other types of communities, like as we told you in bars, where there are other forms of gambling, where there are people there every single day, where you essentially go there to eat, you can literally sleep there, and you essentially can rot your brain away by playing these games. But thirdly, on dopamine, we tell you again that it is much better to have this dopamine addiction when it comes to sports betting than to things like gambling or even worse, lobbying. Think about the impacts, like let's weigh the impacts of gambling and of sports betting. When you're sports betting, you're essentially only going against your own pockets, your own monetary funds, but that is your responsibility because you are aware that you are doing that. You know, because you have the rationality and the criteria to determine which team you want to invest into. And the moment in which you are, for example, lobbying in politics, it is a much riskier type of environment, but ultimately it is also much more impactful on societal levels, because whereas in the moment in which your favorite team loses, you just lose the money and that's it. When it comes to things like lobbying, you are essentially determining the future of your entire society because you are giving your money to organizations that might not necessarily respect the things that a lot of other people want. But ultimately, you tell us that you are against all forms of gambling. We tell you it is not really your fiat to say this, because at this point, you would have to prove to us what are the exclusive benefits of banning this sports betting on your side of the house, and you're never able to do this. You tell us ultimately that the main harm here is people losing money. But if those are the terms and conditions of doing this sports betting, then we don't really understand why this would be a negative impact. Think about the fact that a lot of times when people use social media, they are aware that there can be privacy breaches. They are exposing themselves to this risk, but they do it willingly. So we cannot possibly believe that in the moment in which someone loses their money, being aware that this possibility can happen, it is that much of a negative impact because they're already aware of it and they already consider the possibility of that happening. But ultimately, no one is holding a gun to your head saying you have to invest $1 million into this sports betting. If you really care about it, you might even invest $20, $30, or whatever. So the extremism on your side of the house just does not work. Ultimately, we tell you that people would become even more fragile in the moment in which they lose the rationale, they become weaker, because our point was saying that in the moment in which on our side of the house, people are aware of the risk they are taking, on your side of the house, they are not, and this leads me to my second point on state intervention. Who actually protects you better? You say these organizations are labeled to make you lose. If this is actually the case, think about how much worse it's going to be on their side of the house in the moment in which they ban sports betting, and in the moment in which there are black market organizations that are scams, but you're not aware that they are scams. They are programmed to make you believe that they are official organizations, and you have no way of actually confirming this. On their point of saying that people are scared to be caught, if these organizations exist in the first place, I believe that they don't actually think they'd be able to get caught because the organization would have to be caught beforehand, and this is just a very extreme mechanism to explain. But ultimately, if these organizations right now are programmed to make you lose, it is easy to spot out as a person that is betting in sports that might be the case. It means that it is known. With scams, you won't be able, first of all, to get your money at all in the case in which this is not a secure organization, but secondly, you would have absolutely no form of prosecution in the moment in which you cannot go to the state and say, I actually invested money into a scam organization. The state would not be able to know whether or not you knew that it was a scam or not, but ultimately they would have to bring forward investigations that are way too extreme to be explaining in this debate. Yes, I'll take one.
It cannot be both. You think that bettors make the most amount of money, or is it the companies making the most amount of money?
I'm sorry, I did not understand the question.
It cannot be both. Do you think that bettors actually make the most amount of money, or is it the actual sports companies?
We're not talking about how much money the bettors make. We're talking about the impacts on the individual psychology of these people who see betting in sports as a form of, we could say, distraction, of amusement. They see it as a form of entertainment. We don't really care if these sport organizations end up getting money in the moment in which a really rich white guy says, I want to invest $50 million into this one sport organization. He is doing that conscientiously, and you can't really believe that the state has the right to intervene in that. So ultimately, we tell you that these sport organizations are positive entities in societies. Note, please, panel, that we never once stated that sport betting is ultimately beneficial to everyone involved. We are telling you that, however, the impacts on the community overall is much better than it would be on their side of the house after they banned these sports. In fact, they never once really mechanized what happens to the sport community in the moment in which you take away this form of sports betting. Apart from the fact of investments, apart from considering these world organizations, we tell you to please consider local communities where there are sports teams that need the support of the people around them. There are sports teams in developing countries that want to have the support of the people around them, want to gather enough money in order to go and do more tournaments and do better tournaments, and ultimately this is a positive impact because it restores the faith in society. But thirdly, on the impacts in the terms of the freedom of choice, you keep telling us that this is a form of self-harm. Exactly, self. Is suicide illegal? I believe that in the moment in which a person puts themselves at risk and tries to do something that they know is not 100% secure, that is their responsibility. And ultimately, the moment in which the money is their property, the state does not have the right to tell them, you cannot invest in this. Think about how many times a father invests a lot of money into universities for their son, and they're not sure whether or not their son is going to be able to then get a good job or maybe not even finish his university course at all. This is an investment. He is aware that he is putting a lot of money at risk, but however, he does it with the possibility of a positive outcome, and we believe this is fully within the right of individuals who can allow for themselves to bet this money. But ultimately, instead of banning these worst things, you were trying to protect people who were betting on sports. You tell us that you were against a lot of these things like gambling and lobbying, but ultimately you focus on sports betting and you're not even able to prove to us what is the exclusivity on your side of the house that makes sports betting so exclusively bad. I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the speech. I now invite the opposition reply speaker.
Is everyone ready? My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Though we concede and we can both agree on the fact that betting on sports is not an activity that you should boast about in your curriculum, we still think that SciProp failed to demonstrate during the course of this debate how banning sports betting would improve society and would improve the life of the individuals who currently engage in sport betting. First of all, let's focus 1 second on the characterization of addiction, which was a huge contradiction during the course of Proposition's team line. We tell you that a cycle of addiction is not caused by watching sports, as Side Proposition has tried to argue during the course of this debate. We tell you during the course of first and second speech that a cycle of addiction is created by societal norms, by genetic makeup, but the fact that you interact with these ads every single day, whether it be about sports betting or whether it be about betting in slots machines, we tell you that addiction happens, and we tell you that Side Proposition worsens this addiction. Now, onto the two main stakeholders of this debate. First of all, the first stakeholder that we find during the course of this debate are individuals that invest a relatively small amount of money into this type of sports betting. Well, why side proposition tries to protect these people by saying that, hey, we save these people like $20. We tell you that actually you are not helping these people. The impact is negative on proposition side. Why? Because we tell you that not allowing these people to use their money is an incursion into their individual liberty, which is a value point that we value more, pardon the repetition, than trying to protect these individuals by banning their freedom to use their money however they want in the extent of rationality. So in conclusion, we believe that saving and protecting the right of these people to their active freedom is much more important than saving them a couple of bucks. Second, we tell you that the other most important stakeholder of this debate were people that actually have active addictions to this sports betting and therefore are willing to bet thousands of dollars, their houses, whatever, into this sports betting. We tell you that actually side proposition's world worsens these conditions for these individuals. Why? Because addiction is not something that you take away simply because people are not allowed to bet on sports anymore legally. That doesn't explain the drug market, for example. We tell you during the course of this debate two key mechanisms. That if you take this away from people that are highly addicted to this type of activities, two things are more likely to happen. One, either these people will start betting in underground rings, which is, first of all, much more persuasive because of the edginess of betting in underground ring. Second, is much more negatively impactful to society as it now actually fuels illegal markets. And third, it's much more harmful to the person in itself because there's no regulation and no accountability. And second mechanism, we tell you that if these people are so addicted, simply taking away sports betting will push them towards worse types of betting. We gave you the example of slot machines and again, and was not interrupted by side proposition. Why are slot machines worse? Because they do not have the exclusive benefit of frequency. For example, if I bet on my favorite team, I'm not going to bet on my favorite team every hour of every single day. That is, however, possible with slot machines. And second, we tell you that sports betting at least has some degree of rationality and can be seen as a monetary investment. That does not happen with slot machines, which ultimately fries the brain of the person even in a worse manner. So what is our side of the house and why is the status quo preferable, albeit the negative impacts that it still has? Well, first of all, we tell you that in our side of the house, if a person is highly addicted and spends the entirety of their money into these sports betting, in the worst case scenario, we tell you that at least they're still regulated and these people are allowed to complain and sue this company if something goes wrong. Ultimately, in our side of the house, these people won't be chased down by criminal rings which run these illegal courts inside proposition's world. Second, we tell you that in our side of the house, there's exclusive benefit of sports communities that are better supported even in developing countries. And third, we tell you that on our side of the house, the much stronger value of active freedom is protected. We much prefer our world. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And for the final speech, I invite the proposition reply speaker.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition was allergic to the idea of evolving their case at all in this debate, or even being generous to our side at all. I'll deal with two things in this speech. Firstly, on the cycle of addiction, and which side actually betters this. But secondly, then, on the principle. Firstly, then, on the cycle of addiction. Because what was their biggest push? They essentially told you that people are so addicted that they would turn to illicit markets. Note that literally down the bench, we gave you independent 6 structural reasons as to why they probably will not. At most, they respond to one, which is to say, well, people actually do know about illegal sites, get over it. There's still 5 other reasons that you haven't engaged with at all. The fact that there's a fear of prosecution, the fact that this ban is global. So on their side, you have some countries that have regulations that are being rolled back. That is why essentially we admit political capital is symmetric on either side, but it is their side that has regulations rolling back because those players are still in the market. And we gave you a bunch of reasons as to why now that it is not in your face, it is far likely that you won't be able to to be able to be sucked into this addiction cycle. But here we were super charitable, and they completely missed this framing. We literally assumed that a chunk of people will actually get sucked into this illicit market. We told you that this was a trade-off we were absolutely willing to make for a few reasons. Number one, the fact that this stops a lot of future victims from being able to access this properly. Because note the analysis we gave you from second, which is essentially to say the people who are the worst of the worst, who have the worst addictions, we think are symmetric on either side. Because I agree, they probably will try to access the illicit market. But it's about the thousands of individuals that no longer have to see ads on the street, that no longer have the peer pressure within your local bar to bet because it is something that is illegal. But secondly, also because of scale of quantity, the fact that there are some people who are currently addicted right now, but the number of people that it could impact in the future is infinite. We think that we ultimately won this on weighing. But the second thing that they tell you here is, well, you'll ultimately turn to worse forms of addiction. And the first thing I want to note was that in their Hail Mary's assertion in their third was to essentially say that a lot of this analysis on culture that exists is extreme, things like macho and ego culture. But if anything, it is not. If anything, they say that people, essentially they say people care so much about sports. That's exactly why you see swaths of people in pubs and essentially within their friend groups caring so much about this. Because sure, if you're so confident in your knowledge of sports, please put your money where your mouth is. That was essentially the analysis we gave you all the way from Fatma's speech that literally got no meaningful engagement at all. But the last thing they tried to tell you here is, and this is like a weird point, they tell you about the sports community and how they will essentially bond with each other. Firstly, they can now enjoy sports without the financial burden. That was essentially the comparative we told you from the beginning. But second, they essentially tell you about companies. Know that we don't think that billion-dollar companies like FIFA essentially need this sports betting in the first place. They never actually explain why, number one, it gets to them rather than the gambling or betting companies itself. But second, if they even needed this funding in the first place, I actually have no idea by the end of this debate. But secondly then, let's actually deal with the principle. I want to note two things here. Firstly, both sides agree that there's a harm that exists with betting and that the government should to an extent intervene. We essentially say a ban, they say regulations. But here is where we broke the deadlock, because on our side, it's far more likely that a lot of people are stopped when it comes to banning. Because at the point where on our side, it happens at one-time slice, right? Essentially when a lot of individuals, when these countries essentially ban, it means that you cannot have this industry existing anymore. But on their side, there's an incentive to roll back regulations because the players are still in the market. But secondly, I am just so confused by their strategy, because they essentially say, well, the government should intervene to an extent. Then in their whip, they completely change the strategy and say, well, we don't illegalize suicide, so surely we can allow people to harm themselves. Panel, that is not the point, because they essentially tell you, well, you might just invest $20. I agree. Some people initially do invest $20, but the problem is that the accumulation of the funds that happen towards the end, because you think you're just spending $20, but you look towards the end of the month and you essentially see you've spent $500 on different Premier League matches that have happened. That was the burden. It was not about the initial, but rather what happens into the long term. For those reasons, we have clearly won this debate.